Hello, welcome to this video based on an online event for the NOVIA weekend course on Renaissance music. NOVIA's weekend course, A Practical Introduction to Renaissance Music, paves the way for the study of Baroque music by looking at what was happening in the decades immediately before the year 1600, which we see as the beginning of the Baroque. This is an excellent idea. It places us in a position of moving chronologically through history with the composers and performers of the time. So that weekend practical course is an introduction to Renaissance music, which is introducing the ideas that will become important in Baroque music. And this online talk is an introduction and a setting out of some of the theoretical ideas that will help us in our practical work on Renaissance music. So right now, this is the introduction to the introduction to the introduction to the introduction. Welcome. So today we're looking at the background to the late Renaissance, at concepts and context, ideas and assumptions that they had in the late 1500s. Practices and aims, what they were actually doing, what they were aiming for, what they were trying to develop. And I've divided it into two halves, notation and performance. This is not going to be a history lecture, not even a cultural or music history lecture. In fact, I'm trying to get away from the approach of music historians, which sometimes tends to emphasize looking back from where we are today, looking backwards through history, with subjects like the development of opera or the development of the orchestra. Well, in the late 16th century, they didn't realize that what they were developing in music drama was going to turn into what we nowadays call Baroque opera. And they had no idea that their developments of instrumental music, the music for so-called divided choirs, double and triple ensembles separated spatially, in Venice especially, that those experiments would be lumped into what we see as the development of the orchestra. They were making their music and trying to achieve their aims. And when we look backwards through history, we tend to get a very distorted view. When we look backwards, what looms largest is that CD we really like to listen to. And then maybe some things from the previous century, historical recordings, whatever was fashionable during the 20th century. There's that immense block of romanticism, and somewhere in the distance we see Vivaldi and Bach and Handel. That's real Baroque music, isn't it? Behind them we can just about make out Monteverdi and Lully, and in the far, far distance is Palestrina. We don't want to be looking this way. Rather, we want to be looking with them, moving with them forwards through history. So it's an excellent idea that as you're preparing for Baroque music, that you do some preliminary study of the end of the Renaissance, of what people were learning, how the teachers of our Baroque performers and composers, how the teachers were playing, how the teachers were thinking. So we're moving forwards through history with them. And of course, even these labels, Renaissance and Baroque, they're much later labels that we've pinned onto these periods. The people at the time didn't call themselves a Renaissance, and they didn't wake up on January the 1st, 1600 and say, okay, now we're Baroque. But nevertheless, right around 1600, there was a feeling that something new was happening. Famously, there's that publication by Caccini, Le Nuove Musiche, the new music. There's a new genre which we have called opera. They did not. But the first of those all-sung music dramas appeared also in 1600. And we also have Viadana's religious music for solo singers and continuo around 1602. The publication by Cavalieri, Rappresentazione di Anima e Corpo, also in 1600, is also the first publication to use continuo notation, which became the defining feature of Baroque music making. So that's all that is new around 1600. And what is old and still continuing is the older tradition of polyphony, exemplified by Palestrina. Our view, we're trying to get this view from the inside, what they were doing and what they were aiming for. On the top right, you'll see a scene from the Florentine Intermedii of 1589. Now, we tend to study this as part of the history of opera, but we've already seen that this term opera is not actually one that they were using, and our looking for a story of the development of opera is somewhat misleading because they didn't know they were developing opera. They were aiming for their own purposes, which was slightly different. So this viewpoint that we're looking for is the viewpoint of historical performance practice, what they were doing, what they were aiming for. And so I've given you some little illustrations there of particular publications that we're going to be studying in our practical course. What is early music? Well, we could spend the whole talk, in fact, we could spend a whole semester of seminars discussing what is early music. But I'm going to simplify that. We're not thinking about trying to be authentic. We cannot be 100% authentic, and in certain ways we don't want to be. So this is a word that we tend not to use so much, and rather we describe what we're doing as historically informed performance. And it means exactly what it says. We're using historical information to guide our performances. Now, sometimes we might think that there's two ways of doing things. There's a mainstream way and an early music way. That's a little misleading because there is not one early music way to perform. It depends which century you're in, which country you're in. There were many different performance practices in different places and at different times. So we're trying to inform ourselves very specifically. We also sometimes tend to think that there's the mainstream way to play and the early music way to play, but actually we need to be aware that there are many differences between what we commonly do in today's early music compared to what they actually did in the past. So we need to be thinking at least of three possibilities. A mainstream approach, the approach of today's early music, and what was actually happening back then. And the illustrations here show a modern orchestra in London who call themselves the Renaissance Orchestra, completely modern orchestra. And then an early music project which called itself the Renaissance Orchestra. Now they have early instruments, but there's a conductor at the front, and the seating plan looks exactly like a modern orchestra. And the conductor is using essentially modern conducting technique. And then bottom right, we've got a period image of an assembly of instrumentalists, and slightly different combination of instruments, very different seating plan, and notice the absence of a conductor. There is no conductor. So this is the whole thing that we're aiming for in early music. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So we expect things to be different. That's why we're going to all the trouble to examine this historical information, and we should enjoy those differences. We might be surprised by them at first, but we shouldn't be dismayed by the differences. That's why we're here. That's why we want to do it. The past is a foreign country. There's very little we can say about it until we've learned its language and understood its assumptions. So this is all about context. As we dive into the late 16th century, we want to understand how they are talking and what they already assumed, because our modern day assumptions are going to be very different. There's a nice Baroque gesture showing binary opposites, alternatives. And these are some binary opposites that we have to be a bit careful with. The idea of theory and practice. Well, theoretical music was not what we think of as music theory. We're going to do today quite a bit of what we think of as being music theory, looking at notation and at the various things that underlie the actual practice of music making. But their idea of theoretical music was quite different. It was theorizing, speculating, for example, what sounds do the planets make as they orbit around the Earth? Yes, I said that carefully. What sound does the moon make as it orbits around the Earth? It's a commonplace in early music that we problematize the binary of technique and interpretation, because when we study early music, we realize that a lot of what looks like technique, how you sing, how you play your instrument, builds in stylistic elements, which we might, in modern terms, think of as being interpretation. A lot of the small details about what we do in early music are built into our technique, so that we don't have to think about them all the time. We're not making conscious choices and decisions. This is what we always do. It's built into our fingers. It's built into the way we breathe and use our voices. And then another binary that we have to be careful with is composer-performer. There was much more crossover. Many composers were active performers, and most performers used elements of composition in their actual performance, most obviously adding ornamentation and other improvised elements. And then perhaps the most problematic aspect of all, conductors. So I've given you another picture of a modern band with that dinosaur of our times, a conductor. And then on bottom right, a period image. And if you look at the woman who's seated, those yellow arrows down and up show what she's doing with her hand. She is beating time. She is making with her hand the tactus, so-called. Notice that some of the players actually have their back to her. Not everybody can see her. She's not conducting. She is moving her hand in tactus. We could think of this a little bit like the backing singers in a jazz band. Very often they'll be swinging their arms and clicking their fingers. They are not conducting. They're usually at the back of the band. Many players can't see them. What they're doing is part of the physicality of rhythm in their style. And it's the physicality of rhythm in early music that we've largely ignored. Even early music is still stuck with the dinosaur of conductors. So in today's presentation, we're looking at things that were old, the context that was already there in the late 16th century, the late 1500s. And we're looking at the new. What are they aiming for? What are they trying to do with their music? What do they want next? Concepts and context, practices and aims, and our big chapter headings before the break, notation, and after the break, performance. Let's begin with notation. So here are examples of 3 different kinds of notation from the period. Top right is something that looks very familiar with us. It's a manuscript, but it's a short score and it has bar lines. The bar lines are there because it's a score. The bar lines help you line up vertically. Bottom right is choir book format, individual parts, but laid out on one big page so that the 6 singers can crowd round and all read from this one page. And the page turns are coordinated so that you all turn the page at the same time, which is obviously necessary. Individual parts, much more the usual way of presenting music for performers. And no bar lines, because there's nothing lined up vertically other than page by page. And so there's no need to organize the eye up and down. You're just reading your individual part horizontally. And on the left, an especially beautiful example of tablature. This is for the lute, and it tells you something a bit different. It doesn't tell you what the music is. It tells you where to put your fingers. So those lines, they're not like the lines of a music staff anymore. They actually represent the strings, and the numbers represent which fret you hold down on which string. So it's like a little plan of the neck of the lute, and you pluck the notes that are indicated. That last sentence might sound superfluous. It's like, duh, yeah, so you've got these notes, you pluck the notes that are there. But it's not as simple as that, because in guitar tablature, it might look very similar with a few notes to be held down on the fingerboard. But if you're strumming, the assumption is that you strum all the strings. And so guitar tablature looks very open, but actually, because you're strumming all the strings, it's a much fuller sound than you might think. Tablature has done badly in standard musicology and music history because most musicologists can't read it. They don't have access to it. And so we know much less in general about what's happening from sources in tablature than from sources in other formats. What is music? So most of what people heard was not what we think of as the important music of the period. Most of what people heard would have been chant, and in the countryside, popular melodies, also in the streets of the towns. So chant in the churches and popular melodies, monophonic music, just a single line. Otherwise, the really important, learned, high style is polyphony, not just in the sense of people playing together, but in the sense that each of the instruments or voices is a polyphonic strand of more or less equal importance, with a melody of its own, often sharing that material, that melodic material, from one voice to another, imitating each other, so imitative polyphony. We hear this music liturgically as part of the services in the church. We hear it at the courts, and especially in Italy. Italy was not a single nation, but was divided up into a number of courts, one of them being the Vatican court of the Pope, the papal court. And those different princely courts competed with one another to show what fine culture, especially what fine music culture they had. So this is one of the great treasures of the late Renaissance, is this system of especially Italian courts with all the music making that they supported. Music is also associated with dance, with music drama. So these are the main areas where we're hearing that polyphony. And then there's the whole area of popular music on the streets, in the countryside. We know something of this, but inevitably much less. One of the ways we do know about it is that melodies and other material from popular music making filter upwards into the high culture of polyphony. But if you asked somebody from the late 16th century, what is music? They would not say that it's the stuff that we play at court or in church and the stuff that we hear on the streets or in the fields. They would say that music is the perfect sound made by the movement of the planets and the stars. It's such a perfect music that we humans cannot actually hear it, but it's there. And our humanity, our human nature, is a microcosm of that heavenly perfection. So the harmonious nature of the human being is a reflection of that cosmic perfection in miniature, literally a microcosm. And then the actual music that we play and sing is called musica instrumentalis, but it includes vocal music. Actual music making is an earthly imitation of that heavenly perfection. So a three-level system: the perfection of the music of the spheres, the microcosm of the harmonious nature of the human body, and the actual music that we humans sing and play on Earth. Another three-part, three-level structure concerns all these disciplines, like music. What we think of as the art of music, the ineffable beauty, the mysteries, the subtle mixture of freedom and obligations and techniques, artistry. This is not what they meant by art. For them, art was a coherent set of principles, a set of guidelines. We can actually say a set of rules, what you must do. So nature can sometimes be a little bit rough and can be improved and made more regular by art. So these rules organize our music making. The high, almost undescribable beauty of music and the other, what we would call arts, these mysteries are what they thought of as science. In music, it's especially this idea of the music of the spheres, that somehow the sound and the mathematical aspects of the organization and notation of music are connected to astronomy, what's happening in the heavens, and to other things that are divine and beyond the everyday experience. So all of those things that, in whatever way, we still believe as musicians. All of us musicians believe that there's something to music beyond vibrations in the air, beyond the raw notes written on a page. There's something mysterious and beautiful. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't go to so much trouble to study and make music. This side they call the science. The art is a set of rules of how to do it. And use is the, we say in English, nitty-gritty, the small details, the down and dirty, what you actually do. And quite a lot of this was professional secrets that people would not write down and share openly, because it was part of their special knowledge that they made their livelihood from. So the use, the actual details. And then some modern day answers to this question of what is music. The score is not the music. There used to be a tendency, now strongly being corrected, for traditional musicology to focus on scores, because it's what we had. So you analyzed a score. But our whole early music approach says, yeah, but there's a lot more happening that isn't in the score. So analyzing the score tells you at best only half the story. There's a lot of additional information that we need. And that additional information, this is our historical information that guides our historically informed performance. We read treatises, how to do it documents. Other documents, descriptions of performances, letters from composers to performers and vice versa. Whatever we can read that is going to inform our understanding of the music. We look at iconography, pictures, statues, and so on. And the old instruments themselves and our carefully made modern replicas, they bring us information. The instruments encourage us to do certain things and discourage us from doing other things. So they are also a really important source of information. So now we start with the big chapter of the first part of this talk, notation. We've already seen that typically people have individual parts. Those might be presented in part books where each singer has got a book which contains many pieces, but only their part for each piece. And there's a set of part books, and when we're lucky, the complete set has survived so that we have the whole piece. Sometimes one book is missing and people have to reconstruct the missing part. We've already discussed choir book format, where the individual parts are set out on one page, so 6 or perhaps a few more singers can crowd round one big copy and sing from that. With both these formats, the assumption is that typically about one person is on each part. Might be 2, but about 1. When they did have large ensembles, typically they would group them into smaller self-contained groups. And of course, those groups might well be separated in space. The Venetian style of separated, we say choirs, but they could be instrumental as well as vocal choirs. And on the left here, we have another kind of tablature. This is a keyboard tablature. And again, the keyboard tablature has bar lines, it has vertical divisions, because you have to see what lines up with what vertically. Typically, they are not using bar lines in most of the material that people work from. So as we're looking at old notation, and I really encourage you to use old notation, it becomes ever more accessible thanks to IMSLP and other online sources. We can get for free many original publications and manuscripts. And on the whole, they're much more useful to us than bad 20th century editions or even quickly made 21st century editions. An excellent edition is a useful tool, but the original is really the best thing. And I hope that this quick resume in the next half hour will encourage you to get past some of the initial discouragement of original notation and dive in to see what they're actually writing. So in this first section, I'm talking about how do we find out what pitch they want us to produce? Yeah, how do we notate the pitch level? And the first thing, which can sometimes be daunting, is clefs. They use a lot of different clefs, especially C clefs, but F clefs on almost any line, C clefs on any line, and G clefs also migrate from one line to another. So you just have to get used to dealing with clefs that are at first unfamiliar. On the left-hand side, from our Rore madrigal, Ancora che col partire, the typical combination of clefs, we call them nowadays soprano, alto, tenor, and bass clefs. In early music, we tend to refer to clefs by saying which type of clef, C or F. There are no G clefs in this collection. So C and F clefs, and which line they're on, counting from the bottom. C1, C3, C4, and our familiar bass clef, F4. On the bottom right, the combination of clefs in this Palestrina mass, quite a different combination. Treble clef, G2, so-called mezzo-soprano clef, C2, two voices in alto clef, C3, and two in tenor clef, C4. That's odd. It looks like this piece has no basses in it. That's not the case. This is a kind of coding. So when we see the standard combination of clefs, bottom left, clefs, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, that shows us that we perform the music at the normal pitch, we can say the written pitch. When we see these odd combinations that have an unusually high clef at the top, treble clef, used much less often than the soprano clef, which is a bit lower, and there's a lack of bass clef. There's no bass clef here. This is a coding, and it says transpose the music down. Usually a fourth, perhaps a fifth. There are more complicated rules, but if you start with the idea of down a fourth, you won't go too far wrong, at least as a first start. So this is a coding that means transpose the music down a fourth. And they called this and similar combination of clefs lacking bass with unusual amounts of high clef. They call these combinations Chiavette, the little clefs, and they tell you to transpose down. Notice, as I've already remarked, there are no bar lines in nearly all the original material, and that's because people use bar lines to align the eye vertically to see what coincides. But if you're only looking at one part, you don't need that vertical alignment. The point here for us modern musicians is that bar lines do not do the job of showing where the accent is, not even of showing how much space of time there is. So when there are bar lines, they may be very irregular. Some have 2 semibreves and some have 4 and some have 6. The bars may be very irregular. They don't carry any information of accent, and they're not telling you anything about the beat or rhythm. They're simply aligning the eye, and that's why we don't need them in most of the parts that we're reading from.
I know Chiavette, but still, why did that exist? Why did they use this coding of transposition?
Yes, of course, that's a great question. But of course, this question of why for us is because it looks so strange. It looks like they have a normal situation and they have a strange situation of Chiavette. But another way you could look at it is they just have two situations, both of which were normal to them. They were alternatives. Why do you need the alternatives? Well, sometimes you actually might want to do Chiavette pieces high, if you have a very particular instrumental lineup, for example, but that's not the main reason. The main reason is that in this age before key signatures, you can't write a piece very conveniently in G major. They didn't really like to use sharps, even as accidentals, too often. As we're about to see, sharps don't really even exist in the theoretical music system. So they don't want to use lots of sharps as accidentals through the body of the music, and they don't have a notation of key signatures that were developed later. So if you want a piece in G major, well, you write it in C, and then you say, do it a fourth lower. And it's not so much that they wanted to have access to all the keys, because, then what about A major and what about B major? But G, a kind of major sounding thing on G, that's really necessary because, as we're about to see, G was a really fundamental note. And of course, many of the instruments are set up with low G strings, which they want to make use of as, to use a modern word, the tonic of their music. So it makes, in modern words, we can say it makes G major accessible. But I think the most important thing is for us to realize this was not normal and strange for them, but rather two flavors of normal. And that means that as you read the notation, you can calibrate it either way. So rather like if you travel to the United States, you might have to switch some of your devices to lower voltage. And historically, there are two ways you can calibrate your music notation: to a higher option, which is the one we think of as standard, or to a lower option. And then, of course, with each of those options, the local pitch might be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. So you've got this basic choice, a fourth up or a fourth down, higher or lower, and then the particular fine tuning of calibrating to whatever the local pitch is, the pitch of the organ in your cathedral, the pitch of your cornetto. Violins and other string instruments can tune up and down a bit, but the wind instruments and the organs are fixed where they are. Nice question, thank you. So we organize our analysis of pitch in octaves: C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and now we think it repeats C, D, E, and so on. They worked 6 notes at a time, but with overlapping 6-note groups, which they called hexachords. So one of them starts on this famous low G. In theory, the lowest note there ever is, but of course, some of our instruments later in the Renaissance and going into the Baroque go below this G, and routinely in the Renaissance, they were writing the F and even lower for singers. So it's a theoretical bottom note, and to quote Shakespeare, this note, gamut, is the ground of all accord, but actually they could go lower. So these scales are a bit like our modern do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. They've just got 6, and the first one is called ut. So we have one starting from low G, which goes ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, taking in a low B natural on the way. Another one overlaps and starts on the C and goes ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. That goes from the notes C to A, so it doesn't have a B natural or a B flat. It has neither of those. And then the next overlapping one starts on F, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and that has a B flat in it. The next one is another G one, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, and because we get the syllable mi, ut, re, mi, that takes in the B natural. So we have a soft hexachord, which starts on F and has B flat. We have a hard hexachord that starts on G and has B natural. And we have the natural hexachord, which doesn't have either B flat nor B natural. And so in a typical piece, we see what looks to us like a key signature. There's either B flat or there is not. It's not a key signature. It's actually a kind of clef, and it's telling you which hexachords to use. If there is a B flat, then you can use that F hexachord, the soft one, because that has B flat. And you can also use the natural hexachord because it doesn't commit on the flats. So we can use the natural and the soft when we see that B flat. If there is no B flat, in other words, if we have B natural, Then we must use the hard hexachord, which contains the B natural, and we can also use the natural hexachord. Now, what about if we're in that natural hexachord and we're singing a tune and it goes like this? I'll say the note names with the letter names. D, E, F, G, A, B, A, G, F, E, D. I carefully didn't sing the B. We need to know, as we change hexachord, as we get re, mi, fa, sol, la, we've got one more note. Is it going to be B fa or B mi? Is it going to be B flat or B natural? And the way we know is this nice little rule: one note above la is always sung as fa. So we sing re, mi, fa, sol, la. The extra note becomes fa with B flat. And then we can go down again. La, sol, fa, mi, re. If there's more than one note, then it could be either way, and we really need to think more about our hexachords. But as a quick solution to tunes that go da-dee-doo-dee-dee, da-da-da-da-da, they have the flat as the extra note at the top. That rule comes into play a lot in the late Renaissance. On the left, we see the Guidonian hand, supposedly invented by Guido of Arezzo, showing how you can indicate each of these notes, each of these pitches, as a particular place on your hand, so that a teacher or a choir master can hold up the hand and show people which note to sing by pointing to the hand. This is where it all comes from, and an important style of notation in its own right. So this is a piece of chant. It's actually a chant hymn from a service in church. It's in an F clef, but there are only 4 lines on the stave. And in the late Renaissance, people spent a lot of time reading from this kind of staff and this kind of notation. It doesn't show the durations of the notes in this period. F and C clefs are used. Sometimes a B flat can be used, and there's 4 lines. And this is the tune that gave us those syllables, ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la. So if you follow along, look at the first syllable of each phrase. Ut, que ant laxis, resonare fibris, mira gestorum, famuli tuorum, solve polluti, labile reatum, Sancte Johannes. So that's where they got ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la from. So we know what pitch they're trying to show us. Now we need to know how long the note should last. And they thought of this as measuring the music in time. So it's called mensural notation and mensuration, showing the measure in time, the duration, the note values, we would say in modern language. So there are the shapes. They're not so unfamiliar, and the corresponding rests, again, not so unfamiliar, no real problems with those. Now it starts to get more fun. We have time signatures. They sometimes use things that look to us like time signatures, but they are not. They are mensuration signs, and they are telling you how to measure. And they can be telling you things in 2 ways. They can be telling you how to add up your beats. So you could be thinking 2 beats at a time, 1, 2, or you could be thinking 3 beats at a time, 1, 2, 3. They also tell you how to divide the beats to go to the next faster level of note values. So inside your 1 beat, you might have a division into 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or you might have a division into 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And in principle, at every level of note values from the very longest to the very shortest, you could add up to the next level, either in groups of 3 or in groups of 2, and you could divide into the lower, faster level, either in groups of 2 or groups of 3. And so you need to know what are the combinations at each level of the notation. That's what these signs show you. And by the way, to go into this in more detail, I strongly recommend as an introduction the Wikipedia article, Mensural Notation, in the English Wikipedia at least. It's a really good article and it gives you a lot of detail, but well explained. That's of course only a starting point, but it will actually tell you most of what you need to read from Renaissance notation. Ligatures, sometimes they join the notes together in ways that look a bit like that plain chant notation, and there are quite complicated rules to determine what the note values are when they do these complicated joinings. They're called ligatures. Luckily, this is dying out in our period, and if you come across a ligature, it's most likely to be in the bass part, and really it's very likely to be 2 semibreves. And if you make a wild guess at 2 semibreves, you'll mostly be right, and otherwise you'll have to think quite a lot harder. So don't panic about ligatures. They're mostly going to be in the bass part and 2 semibreves, but there are other possibilities, and your reference books will help you. Here's something else quite different for us with our modern eyes: the way they notate triple time in general. The really important thing is to recognize that you've got into triple time. And we're talking here about the triple division. So you've got a basic beat, and in one way or another, you're dividing it into some kind of 3. So recognizing that it's a 3, it's a triple, rather than a duple division, that's the essential thing. A lot of the time, they use so-called white notation. So that's the kind of note heads that we're used to, but they're going a lot faster than we're used to. So a semibreve rushes by, and minims, looking to us like half notes, those go by really fast. So this white notation, on the first example there, if you look towards the end of the first staff, you'll see the numbers 3, 2. Now there's a lot of debate about exactly what these mensuration signs mean, but the vital thing is to know we're going into triple time, and now there are what look like really long white notes, but actually they're going to fly by very fast in triple time. In the lower example, we've got a mix of white and black notation. So if you look at the first bar, the soprano part in soprano clef, with a B flat helping you understand which notes you are, and an E flat shown, that's white notes in triple time, so they're going fast, and it's a dotted semibreve, a minim, and another semibreve. Da, da, da. They're going fast. In the bass part, it's black notation. You can see it's black. Sometimes they use red, but they could only manage multicolor when they really had time and money to spend. So they just used black and white most of the time, and for most printing especially. Though this is manuscripts. It's part of the intermedi that we will be studying in our practical weekend. So in the bass part, we've got a breve, brevis, with a dot, written in black notation, and the bass part carries on for the next 2 bars with black notation, semibreve, breve, and another dotted breve, and then it goes into white notation. So these are just 2 alternatives, and mostly they mean the same thing, but there is a little difference about how they operate, and that is something which they called perfection, and you have to watch out for this. When you're in white notation, a semibreve normally contains 3 minims. Aha! This is this perfect division of the semibreve into 3 minims. So in white notation, semibreves usually have 3 minims. But if you see a semibreve followed by a minim, then that makes a perfect group by itself. And the semibreve is just 2, and the minim makes the third one. There are 3 elements in the subdivision. So they have to be careful when they write a semibreve and a minim, they have to be careful not to trigger this by mistake. And so if you look at the soprano part again, there's a dot after the semibreve. Now we read that as a dot of prolongation, making the semibreve half as long again. And it works, we could read it that way. They didn't mean it that way. For them, it's a dot of perfection. It says, okay, there's a minim coming, but this dot shows you that the perfect group is that semibreve on its own. It's worth 3 minims. In black notation, this rule of making perfections does not apply. And so in the second bar of the bass, we've got a semibreve and a black breve, and that black breve is quite happy to say imperfect with only 2 semibreves, not 3. So black notation can stay imperfect, white notation is subject to perfection. So that's why they needed the 2 options. Again, it's a bit like the system with Chiavette. To us, black notation looks really weird. To them, it's 2 alternatives. They sometimes use one, sometimes the other. They have subtly different uses. It's not normal versus weird. It's 2 normal options. What is time? Here we are in 2023, but most of us would feel a bit daunted if we were asked to explain Einstein's relativistic time. It's not really part of our everyday experience, and we certainly don't use it for music making. We think of time as an ever-rolling stream, a fixed scale going in one direction only, and against our fixed scale of time, we can measure the movement of the sun, we can measure the accuracy of our clocks, and we can measure the tempo of music. That's what we're all used to. That time that we're so used to is Newton's absolute time, time like an ever-rolling stream. That's an early hymn, somewhat after Newton's time, by a priest who was way ahead and trying to adopt these very new ideas. In general, Newton's ideas were not accepted until much later. So there's Newton's absolute time that we're so comfortable with, but see how it lines up with the music that we're trying to play. Most of the music we're interested in early music, and especially in today's seminar, is music of an earlier time. That earlier time is Aristotle's time. It's very different. Time is a number of movement, says Aristotle. And it's as counterintuitive to us today as Einstein's relativistic time. We need to study this. What are the implications of this Aristotelian time for the performance of 16th and 17th century music? Well, that could be a year of seminars. But the important thing to take away with you is that time is not quite the thing that we're comfortable with today. And it's based on movement. So somehow we have to calibrate this musical notation to actual real world time. just as we had to calibrate the notation of pitch to an actual pitch. And there are big options, very different options, if you like, 3 gears that we could be in. So according to the mensuration mark, a whole note might last 1 second, or a dotted whole note might last 1 second, or a minim might last 1 second. So those are big changes. And then, of course, locally, it's how long do you think a second is? Because they didn't have digital watches and their clocks couldn't yet measure a second. They showed a second, perhaps with a tick, but it wasn't exactly a second. So a second is what you feel it to be. So just as with pitch, there are local variations, so there are with time. And if you're in a big cathedral, you probably take everything a little bit slower, whereas if you're in a small dry room at court, you probably take everything a little bit faster. It's what feels to be 1 second. And I've reminded you there, Aristotle, time equals movement. So this is Zacconi writing at the end of the 1500s, summing up the theoretical practices of the past and guiding the way for the future. He says all these things are the same, misura, the way we indicate note values in our notation of music, misura. Battuta, a beat. By the way, this book is extremely important. There is your reference book for this subject. A beat, there's somebody with a stick, others have got their hands on the shoulders of the person in front. They are literally hitting, they are beating in time. And notice that there are multiple beaters in that example. And then a more typical example for the slightly later period, end of the Renaissance and during the 17th century, using the hand just in the air, a light touch. In Latin, it's tactus, and that's the word we use nowadays, using the hand just going down and up to show the beat, to show how long those note values actually last. And all of this is just time. It's time itself. When you beat tactus with your hand, you are showing time, which for them was defined by the perfect movement of the sun and the stars. So like the hand of God that turns the wheels of the universe, your tactus hand is trying to be perfectly steady. When we want to divide up that beat into various proportions, then as we go down up, there's a medium version, which is the easiest. We go 3 on the down, 3 on the up, down, 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 up, 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 down, 2, 3, up, 2, 3. There's a slow version, a kind of 3 against 2, down, up, 1, 2, 3. And there's a very fast version, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, down 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The down and up combined is called tactus. One way is called semitactus, and there's another one, the other way, which is the other semitactus. In Spanish sources, they talk about compás and compasillo. You can compare this to chiave and chiavette, the different notations of speed. There are different options. You need to know which option you're in. Zacconi uses the idea of a clock that, if you like, the ticking pendulum, discovered right around the year 1600 by Galileo, the ticking pendulum is the tactus beat. That pendulum always moves the same way, it just moves in 2 directions, this way, that way, just like the tactus hand goes down and up. But the gears of the clock, the cogwheels, can turn that one movement into different possibilities, dividing into 2, 1, 2, up, 2, down to, up to, and dividing into 3 in different ways, as we've just seen. I should say that the fine detail of exactly how to interpret the notation is still debated, and in our practical course, I'll show you my practical approach. The text, the words, is also an influence on the note lengths. They have this idea of good and bad syllables, more about that later, which Caccini calls long and short. There's a tendency for Italians to make the good syllable actually longer in duration, just a bit. The last syllable is typically a bad, so the last note of the music, even if it's written as a very long note, is typically performed short and unaccented. And then if we look at words like legato and staccato, words sound like what they mean. So the meaning of the words influences the sound that we produce as we perform those words. Because of this influence of the words, Zacconi says the singer always has permission to perform the note after the beat, to let it be heard more beautifully. This is really shocking, and nobody is doing this in today's early music. But singers are allowed to be not together in polyphony. Shock horror. And Zacconi also says, even if, for the beauties of singing, singers sometimes slow down a bit, the tactus beater should not take any notice. They should not be flexible for any singer. So the beat goes on, but the singers are not necessarily on it. And this is like Ella Fitzgerald. It's like jazz. There's a steady beat there, but a fine singer works around it. An extraordinary sound that we're going to experiment with in our practical weekend, but that is almost never done in today's early music. And with the next slide, I've introduced the word intermedio. This was a musical entertainment in the intermission, in the pauses, in the intervals between the acts of a Renaissance spoken play. And just as in real life, the pauses are sometimes more important than the stuff around it. So this is our all-important pause.